Assalamu alaikum dear students. So welcome to the course of Translation Studies. I'm your teacher Jahanzeb Jahan and I'll teach you about the translation of poetry. Before going to the slides, we'll first talk about the importance of translation. So this subject is emerging quite quick and fast, and it is a buzzword in the present days. You can do your master's, MPhil, and PhD in translation studies. So many universities at international and national level, they're offering translation studies as a major discipline. So this is quite a frequent and common subject, and this needs to be attended with quite concentration and with your complete interest in that, because translation is not that easy as we consider it to be. So to give an exact definition, a meaning of translation is not an easy task. Translation, like poetry, has become elusive. It is both a substitution and a transference of meaning from one language, that is source language, predominantly known as SL, to another language, that is called TL, target language, and neither. The concept of translation has undergone a sea change over the years. The theories of translation developed from purely linguistic approach of the 60s to textual focus of the 70s have now yielded place to the cultural based theory. So from a longer time, there have been certain theories that are developed on translation studies, and nowadays people are paying more attention to this subject because this subject is quite common. So predominantly translation is transferring the meaning from the source language to a target language. For example, if some text is written in English and we have to translate that into Urdu, so the source language will be English and the target language will be Urdu. Now, for this task that we are transferring some meaning from source to target language, we need certain skills in prose and especially in poetry, because without those skills, or without knowing how to learn those skills, we cannot master the ability of translating the material from one language to another. Translation studies is also important nowadays because you as a student can go online and find certain websites, for example freelancer.com. So you can create your account there and you can be a freelancer. You can translate certain things in certain parameters in certain time, and you are paid handsome amount for that. People are earning in thousands just by sitting at home and doing translations online. So this is quite common subject online, and this is quite handsomely paying to the students and those who are sitting at home. The word translation derives from the Latin translatio, which itself comes from trans and fero, together, meaning to carry across or to bring across. So trans and fero are two words that are made together, which mean to carry across something or to bring across something. So while translating, we are carrying across or bringing across meanings from one language to another. So this is how the translation works, that we focus on the source language and we convert, we bring across or carry across the meaning into the target language. There are certain definitions of translation. Dr. Johnson, he says that change into another language retaining sense. So this word sense is quite important here, that we need to change the meaning, but we should not change the sense of something. So if we change the sense of something, we lose the pleasure that is coming. We use the aesthetic pleasure that we get from the original text. A.H. Smith says, to translate is to change into another language, retaining as much of the sense as one can. So again, he focuses on the same thing, that we may transfer the meaning, but we should not lose the taste of it. we should not lose the nectar of it or gist of it, that is basically giving us the player or the aesthetic sense, aesthetic player. Catford says, the replacement of textual material in one language by equivalent material in another language. So first of all, we need to see that whether do we have the equivalent material in the other language or not. For example, if we talk about English and Urdu language, there are so many words in Urdu language which are non-existent in English. You call your brother of your father as uncle. You call the brother of your mother as uncle. Maximum you add paternal or maternal to it. Similar is the case with your cousins and your niece and nephews. But in Urdu we have, or in Punjabi as well, we have a huge variety. We have different names for every relation. So this is some restraint in a language. So whenever we are transferring a material from one language to another, we should be taking care of the fact that do we have the essential equivalent material available or not. Survey says that it is an art. So this is really an art because you need skill for it. For any art, you need proficiency. You need a frequency of your caliber that helps in development of that art. So this is truly an art. Host friend says, translation is neither a creative art nor an imitative art, but stands somewhere between the two. So neither are you copying the material nor are you being too much creative. So there is difference. So we should be staying in between. So especially while translating the poetry, we should be taking care of this thing that we should not be too much creative or too much imitative. So if we are too much imitative, we are losing the player, or if we are being too much creative, we are losing the meaning at all, because the two of them will go the other ways. We should stay in between somewhere. So the following points sum up the nature of translation. First of all, change from SL, source language, to TL, target language, retaining sense by using TL equivalents. TL means target language and SL means source language. So we need to change some document or text from source language to target language, but we should take care that we retain the sense. The sense is not destroyed, the sense is preserved. So in poetry especially, we should be taking care of the fact, because in poetry we have meters, we have rhythm, we have alliteration in that, which creates good effect. Alliteration in a way is like how high his honor holds his haughty head. So this is alliteration. Beading bubbles, winking at the brim, this is alliteration. So if we are transforming something into something, we should be retaining the sense of it, so that the player of the poetry is not destroyed. Secondly, translation is a bridge between creative and imitative art. So when we are creative, we are being novel, we are being too much different. When we are being imitative, we are copying word to word. So this is somewhere in between. Then complex procedure involving analysis, transfer and restructuring. So translation is a complex procedure. It is not simple as we understand it to be. We make an analysis, then we transfer the meanings, and then we restructure it. So converting something from one language to another language is basically restructuring the words and transferring them. But again, the sense should be retained. The transference of meaning and structure. So it is also the change of meaning and the change of language, because English language has its own structure, and the target language in which you are translating, for example in Urdu, so that language has its own structure. So we should be taking care of the meaning and structure as well. So translating poetry. Someone has given a very good definition that translation is like a woman. It can be fair but not beautiful. It can be beautiful but not fair. So I'm not being anti-feminist here, but this is a definition about translation studies which is given very accurately, that translation can be like a woman. If woman is fair, like if she is loyal, she is not beautiful. If she is beautiful, she is not loyal. So this is not said by the person who quoted this, but also many poets have been talking about this, especially John Donne. In his poetry, he's been talking about the disloyalty of women. So here, the person who quoted this means that if we are making a if we are making a loyal translation, loyal means that you're retaining sense and meanings, so you will not make or produce a beautiful translation. Or if you try to produce a beautiful translation, that will not remain loyal. So we cannot be doing this. A translation of poetry is something very difficult. We should be loyal to the original meanings of the source language, and we should also try to make it beautiful by bringing creative abilities. So in very simple words, this is also somewhere in between creative and imitative arts. In poetry, above all, the grammatical categories carry a high semantic importance. In these conditions, the question of translation becomes much more entangled and controversial. The grammatical categories in poetry, they are in so many forms, and they have their own semantic importance. Each word stands for something else. For example, if you're using similes or metaphors, if you're using onomatopoeic words, if you're using some words which are creating alliteration, so all those words are having their semantic sense. So while producing them in some other language becomes difficult. And when you try to do it, the question of translation is endangered, and it is controversial because you are unable to go near the exact translation which is expected. Now, as far as the pun, poetic devices, literary devices, or symbolism, or for example themes, as far as they are concerned, poetry by definition is untranslatable. Like here we come to know that it is quite impossible to translate poetry, because the real poetry in the original sense, in the original language or in the source language or in SL, that has its own pun. Pun means word that may be, or a sentence that may be giving two different meanings for the sake of play. So, and there are poetic devices like assonance and resonance, alliteration, then literary devices that hyperbole, irony. There are so many things, and people use different symbols and different themes in poetry. So if we take care of all these things, defining or translating the poetry is near to impossible. So it is rightly said that poetry becomes untranslatable. Only creative transposition is possible. That you cannot translate poetry, but you can transpose it. You can change the position either. For example, intralingual transposition, that is from one poetic shape into another. For example, if there is a sonnet, you may turn the sonnet into a heroic couplet, or you may change it into an epic in the same language. Or interlingual, that is from one language into another, that you are changing the language, you're changing the structure of the poetry, you're changing the meaning into some different language. Or finally, intersemiotic transposition, that is from one system of science into another, like from verbal arts into music, dance, cinema, or painting. That some poems, they have been changed into paintings, and some paintings have been changed into poems. Some poems have been changed into dramas, some dramas have been changed into paintings. So this keeps happening. But again, whether you are going for intralingual, interlingual, or intersemiotic, these transpositions are possible, but again the poetry and the player of the poetry remains untranslatable. You can do it by using these three things: interlingual, intralingual, or intersemiotic. But there is always a danger that we'll use the initial or the original player that is coming through the dramas or the poetry, especially the poetic forms. Now, translating poetry and prose, there is difference when you are translating prose, and there is difference when you're translating poetry. The novel is not less rhythmic than poetry. It even comprises multiplicity of rhythms, since the entire bulk of the novel is thus in movement. It is fortunately difficult for translation to destroy this rhythmic movement. This explains why even a great but badly translated novel continues to transport us. Poetry and theatre are more fragile, yet the deforming translation can considerably affect the rhythm. So, why are novels are not affected? For example, there's so many longer texts which are written in the archaic English or some other languages. They are translated into English or Urdu, and we read them. They naturally keep getting popularity. For example, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, that is not originally written in English language, but it is one of the best sellers in English language. So there's so many novels or so many prose works which are written in some different languages but are read in the target languages, because they have huge bulk of it. The text is huge and rhythm is maintained. But when we talk about poetry, so it is in a shorter form. Poems are longer and shorter. Mostly poems are shorter nowadays, but now transferring them into some different language affects the rhythm. So it is fragile thing. Theatre and poetry, if we are trying to transform them into some different language, that becomes hazardous, that becomes dangerous, because we have a danger of losing the initial charm or the original charm that is coming from the source language. So prose work can stand that change, but the poetic works cannot stand that change. So we need quite good effort while translating something from one poetic work into some other poetic work in some other language. Richard Burton says, "I have sometimes suspected that the radical distinction between poetry and prose lies in the very different expectations of readers. Poetry presupposes an intensity that is not tolerated in prose." So, have you ever thought, reading some novel, that why didn't you get this idea? But you must have thought this by reading a poetic work, that that you must have wished that you could write such kind of words. Like someone says that I want to set water on fire. So this is something quite amusing, that setting water on fire. So these are the poetic gestures, expressions that we're using. We cannot use them in prose because the prose is in a longer text, and poetry is something intensive. We explain ourselves. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings reflected in tranquility. So this is what Wordsworth said, that you only compose a poem when you have time for it, when you have ideas for it, and when you have an environment for it. You can get an environment for prose anywhere, but for poetry you need a particular place with a particular flow of emotions, particular ideas, and those ideas are always intense. The way we express our love for someone in poetry, we cannot for sure do it in prose work. So whenever we are changing some work from one language to another, like we're translating one poetic work to another language, we lose that intensity. So the intense feelings which are written by the native speaker of the language cannot be felt or written by the non-native speaker in some other language. So we need to be very much sure about the intensity, because intensity is the soul of any poetic work. Poetry translation. So the translation of poetry is generally considered to be the most difficult. Metrical translations, rhymed translation, blank translations, there are different subcategories of poetry translation. That you have to take care of the meters, you have to take care of the rhyme, you have to take care of the blank verses. These all come in the subcategories of poetic translation, whereas in prose translation, the translators translate prose using different approaches to the text. You can be critical towards it, you can be ironic towards it, but in poetry you need to be taking care of so many minute things. Like a meter is a minute thing, rhyme is minute thing, and if you are changing that poetic work, you are destroying that metrical metrical symmetry of the poem or the rhyme scheme of the poem. So if I say that Coleridge, in his rhyme on Ancient Mariner, he says, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So he's using repetition and alliteration, both things in two lines. So his two lines are filled with repetition and alliteration, two poetic devices in two lines. And what a beautiful thing he has said, that he says it when he is sailing in a sea, and there he, since the sea is salty and they don't have their amount of water left on the boat, so he says this, that since they cannot drink salty water, so he says water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So it means that having enough water around, they're unable to drink that. So that repetition and alliteration, they're very much there. Now try changing it into any other language. You will lose the soul of it. Keats says, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes play on. Now, how will you translate that? You may be able to translate that, but you will lose the charm that is coming from those lines. Now the lapdogs give themselves the rousing shake, and sleepless lovers just at 12 awake. Alexander Pope writes in The Rape of the Lock. How are we going to change that? We are able to change that using those three patterns that we developed, that intersemiotic, interlingual or intralingual, but again we are losing the charm of the poetry. Similarly, if something is written in Urdu or Punjabi or any other language, if we try to translate that into English language, that thing will automatically lose its charm. So I'll prove it how. We have one example in this slide. Now there are certain problems of translating the poetry. Robert Frost says, poetry is that which is lost in translation because of the following reasons. So whenever there is translation, you have everything, but you have lost the poetry. So the poem, the poetry is in fact lost. People have tried to translate Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, the two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I. Now this poem is the hallmark of Frost's genius. Now this poem could never produce the effect that Robert Frost produced in his original text, in his original language, in the source language. So he says that there are following reasons on the basis of which the poetry is lost whenever we are translating it. So first of all is literary echoes. Now this means the most difficult thing in poetry translation is to find equivalent words of literary echoes in the target language. That you cannot find suitability of the words while transforming one piece of literature into another language. So you will definitely lose something out of it. As I said that we have so many relations in our Urdu and Punjabi language which we cannot find in English language. Then allusions and references. Allusions create ambiguity. They cannot be recognized for the common people. therefore they are difficult to translate. For example, Ode to a Nightingale. Now, Ode to a Nightingale is a great poem by John Keats. So in that poem, he's talking about his escapism and his imagination. He wants to be in the world of Nightingale. So there are certain allusions. He talks about hemlock, he talks about the vintage, he talks about Bacchus and his parts. He talks about certain flowers which are common to England and the very culture and the environment of England. He talks about many mythological things which are particular to Greek and English language. So if we are trying to change that, we are losing the ambiguity. If you try to translate them, if you do not know in your culture the synonym of those things, you will not be able to understand them. Because this is the language constraint, the language barrier, that we cannot afford to translate certain allusions. So allusions are creating ambiguity. We cannot understand a poem in original or source palaya that we can understand in the source language. Ornamental words. So rhetorical words based on lyricism are almost impossible to translate. So there are certain words which are based on lyricism, that are poetic form, in which they're like the ode that is meant to be sung, that is basically a song in which the poet is addressing something. So a thing of beauty is joy forever. How are you going to translate that? These are ornamental words. And Keats says that in his poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, he says that beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all you know on earth. That is all you need to know. How are we going to translate that? Because these are the ornamental words that he has used, and translating them into some other language may give us the meaning, what he wants to say. But we will never be having that playa which we can get in the source language. Then rhythm. Rhythm is one of the basic ingredients of poetry, but it is untranslatable. The rhythm of every language is particular to itself. We don't find iambic pentameters used in Punjabi language. So if the poem is written in that, how are we going to translate that? That is a question. Figures of speech. So figures of speech such as similes, metaphors, irony, paradox, they make the job of the translator very difficult and confusing. Some similes and metaphors, they're particular to some proper culture, some particular tradition, some particular language, some particular geographical background. So since we do not have that particular language, culture, geographical background, we are unable to comprehend those figures of speech. For example, if I say that Penelope's loyalty, now Penelope's loyalty can only be understood if we are aware of certain English poems like Ulysses, or we are aware of Odysseus in Greek mythology. How are we going to explain this thing in our language, since we don't have those mythologies in our culture? We do not believe in mythologies. So how can we translate the mythological works if we are non-believers in that, if we are not believing in those things? Then syntactic patterns. Syntactic patterns such as morphological parallelism, syntactic parallelism, and above all, syntagmatic and paradigmatic relation between words make the job of translator very intricate. So syntagmatic is a chain relation, paradigmatic is the relation between the words, the way they can be replaced. How can we do it in some other language? So these all things are making the job of a poet or a translator quite difficult, because we don't find the quite good or reasonable equivalent for the sake. Now the translator should be qualified if he wants to translate something in poetry. He must know two languages, the source language and the target language, equally well. A creative writer can perform his role well by being monolingual, but a translator must be bilingual. He should have in-depth knowledge of colloquialism, slang, and dialects of both the languages. Now, what is the difference between a creative writer and a translator? So the creative writer is someone who will read one work, and he will produce the translation of it in his own language. He may not be knowing the proper colloquialism, proper slangs, proper dialects, but at least he can translate that into his own native language or the target language. But the poetry demands that you should be knowing both the languages, the source language and the target language, that you don't only translate or transform the meanings, but also you maintain the colloquialism, you maintain the slang language, you maintain the dialects which are used there. And also, this also solves the issues of syntactic patterns and all those which we have discussed in the last slide. They can only be overcome if we are quite familiar with both the languages. So if we are not expert of one language, we are unable to be a proper translator. Like those people who are translating the Holy Quran, so that is the best thing ever, the best job ever, translating the best book. So such a person should not only be an expert of Arabic language, but also should be an expert of English or Urdu or in whatever language he is trying to translate the Holy Book. So if he says that he is only expert in Urdu language, he cannot translate the things from Arabic into Urdu, because he must be knowing the Arabic culture, he must be knowing the Arabic grammar, he must be knowing the Arabic environment in which the Holy Quran was written. So there is context behind every verse in Holy Quran. We should be knowing that only if we are able to understand that how to translate that. So purpose of translation of poetry. The purpose of translation is to make the source language text available in the target language for the readers to get the true meaning of it. So we don't only have to translate, but also we have to give the true meanings. These are two different things, translating and translating by giving the true meanings and the true player too. Reading is primarily meant for meaning, then comes the aesthetic enjoyment. To do this job successfully, the translator has to develop his skill and cultural insight into both the languages, like source language and target language. So why are we reading something? We are reading for the sake of aesthetic enjoyment. If we are getting the aesthetic enjoyment, it means that the translation is good. This is easy when we are translating novels, as I already suggested, but the thing loses its player when we are translating poetry. And this is the skill of translator, that he has cultural insight and his linguistic skills in both the languages, in source language and in target language. So if a person is having his linguistic and cultural skill only in one language, it is nearly impossible for him, or it is humanly impossible for him to give the aesthetic enjoyment or aesthetic pleasure of the poetry. Translator is a co-creator. So the translator is not an inventor. He is not a creative person altogether. He is a co-creator. So he deserves to be known as co-creator because, like creative writer, he molds words and phrases and gives them a local habitation and a name. So that person should be creative enough, like not creative enough to be that he changes things altogether. He should be creative enough to mold the words and phrases, to change them a bit, to transform them a bit, and like changing them into local parameters, local setup, so that the thing is best understood. Translator is transcreator. So transcreation means recreating source language text in the target language, taking absolute liberty with it and yet being faithful to it. So this means that you are not only writing something, you're also creating something according to your own context, but you are being faithful as well. You're not changing it altogether. You are being close to the main gist of the text. You are being close to the main gist of the poetic work. The translator takes the role of a creator. Translation, when done well, turns out to be a new writing or a creative writing. So people have been working on that, like people have been doing thesis by translating some work into some different language. This is possible. But again, this cannot be done if you are not remaining faithful to it. So in the whole of this discussion in this video lecture is that translation is a difficult job, but we should remain faithful to the original text so that we can convey the complete player that we can get in the source language. If we are able to get the same player in the target language, it means the task is done. We are now able to understand that, and that thing will be called a creative writing. And again, if you are getting confused, I should again say that it should not be that creative, or that person should not be that much creative person that he changes it altogether. Again and again saying the same thing, that the main player on the main theme should be the same. It should not be affected, which is giving the player of it. Yes, certain things like context can be changed. Certain places, certain words which you feel, or which the writer or poet or translator feels that this is not going to harm the poetic player, so he can change that. But he cannot touch, or he should not change those things which affect the poetic player or that aesthetic player or aesthetic enjoyment of the literary text. Translator is a bridge builder. So translator brings the reader, writer, and critics of one nation into contact with the other nations, not only in the field of literature, but also in all areas of human development like science, philosophy, medicine, poetics, law, and religion. So poetry is not the only thing that we do. There are so many things. We have seen translations of science, philosophy, medical sciences, political science and politics books, law, religion. So everything has been translated. It was a time when translation was considered forbidden, and people were burnt alive in England because they tried to change the translation, or they tried to translate Bible into English language. But after Renaissance, the revival of learning, many books from Greek and Latin and Old English, they were changed to the modern English. Many books from Hebrew language, or the old languages or archaic languages, they were changed into the modern languages. So Renaissance has this spirit. That is why we call it revival of learning, that all those learnings which were done there before in the past, they were changed into the English language and people learned those books. So in this way, translator is a bridge builder. He is bringing two nations on a same board. He is bringing them on board. He is bringing them to a mutual platform, that a book written about English environment or French environment is being read by a person living in the Pakistani environment. So this is bringing nations together. So literature helps in that, poetry helps in that, and so many works have been done in translation. But again, faithfulness is necessary. Now this is a poem of Faz, Ahmad Faz, that was translated. This was translated by Daud Kamal, and this is a good translation. Loneliness. There is someone at the door, dear heart. Nay, there is none. Or might be a wanderer. He will go hence, plodding his weary way. Night is done, and evaporates in the thin air of the starry mist, and palaces quiver, the sleepy lamps, hanging by the chains of gold. The sultry paths are sunk in despair, and the unfriendly dust has obliterated the footprints. Fill the cups and drink to the less the bitter wine of loneliness. Lock up your slumber less doors, dear heart, for now no one will be ever come again. This is translated by Daud Kamal. So this is a good translation. This is to some extent near the exact translation that should have been. Daud Kamal is a good South Asian writer who's been translating the works of native people into English. So this may be close to something, the original one. This may be giving the exact player. But again, if you go through the original poem, you will see that that intensity was not there. The intensity that we could feel in the native language of Faz, that is missing in these lines. So this means that translation should not only be beautiful, should not only be giving the meanings, but also it should be loyal. So one theory that says that if translation is loyal, it cannot be beautiful. If beautiful, it cannot be loyal. So we should be there in between somewhere, that we should make such a translation which is beautiful and loyal. Otherwise, poetry is untranslatable. So these are the references which are used in making this video lecture for you. Hope you understood the lecture, and please go through it once again if you have not understood it, because I've tried my best to give you the best of it. The materials, they're very cautiously selected from so many websites and like articles and books. So you will find a diverse views of translation of poetry in this work. Thank you very much.